It was a chilly autumn morning when 34-year-old Daniel Hayes set off for a solo hiking trip in the remote woods of the Cascade Mountains. The forest was thick with towering pines and the air was crisp with the scent of damp earth. Daniel, an experienced hiker, had always found solace in nature's solitude, far from the noise of city life. This time, however, there was an odd sense of unease that lingered as he packed his backpack with supplies, water, food, a map, and a compass. The trail he planned to follow was well-worn but took a deep dive into the wilderness, a place where few people dared to venture. Daniel wasn't worried. He had hiked countless miles in similar terrain, and the idea of getting lost was far from his mind. He relished the quiet, the isolation, and the feeling of being one with the wilderness. After several hours of hiking, the sounds of civilization faded into the distance. The trees grew denser, their canopies thick with leaves that blocked out much of the sunlight. The only noise was the occasional rustle of leaves beneath his boots and the chirp of birds high above. At around noon, Daniel reached the point where the path diverged. A small sign indicated a lesser-known trail that led deeper into the forest, to a secluded waterfall hidden from the usual hiker traffic. It was the perfect spot to take a break, rest, and enjoy the tranquility of the wild. With a sense of adventure, he decided to follow it. As he walked along the narrow trail, the forest seemed to close in on him. The trees were so dense here that it felt as if the sunlight had been entirely swallowed by the thick canopy. The silence was unnerving, almost unnatural. He paused to drink from his water bottle, looking around, sensing the faintest shift in the atmosphere. A cool breeze swept through the trees, but it didn't seem to help shake the odd feeling crawling up his spine. The path led him to a clearing, but instead of the expected waterfall, Daniel found nothing but more trees and tangled undergrowth. He checked his map, realizing he had wandered off the beaten path. Frustrated but not panicked, he retraced his steps, but the trail he had followed was now unrecognizable. It was as if the woods had shifted, swallowing up the very trail he had walked upon just moments before. His heart began to race. He called out, but the only response was the eerie echo of his own voice. The silence that followed was oppressive. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Daniel turned around, trying to remember the direction he had come from. His compass spun wildly in his hand, the needle swinging in erratic circles. The sun, which had been high in the sky just a short while ago, now seemed to be sinking quickly. A sense of dread started to creep in. He had been here before, but it was like the woods had changed, as if they were closing in around him, trapping him. He began walking faster, his boots crunching on the dried leaves underfoot, but each turn only seemed to bring him deeper into the forest. Panic set in as the shadows lengthened, and the once familiar landscape now felt alien. The air grew colder, the breeze sharper, as if the forest was alive, aware of his growing fear. Hours passed. Daniel had lost track of time, his phone dead from lack of signal. He had no way of knowing where he was, no way of knowing how to get back. The trees seemed to close in around him, their bark now twisted and gnarled, like ancient hands reaching out from the depths of the earth. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, but still, he pressed on. Then, through the trees, he saw it. A figure. At first, he thought it was a fellow hiker, but as he drew closer, he realized that it was something far stranger. A man, dressed in old, tattered clothes, stood motionless, his face obscured by a hood. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It was as if he was part of the landscape itself. "Hey!" Daniel called out, stepping closer. The man didn't respond. The hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stood on end. He was sure the figure had not been there moments before. In a sudden flash of instinct, he turned to leave, but when he glanced back, the figure was gone. With the sun now setting behind the horizon, Daniel's sense of panic deepened. He stumbled through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes, desperate to escape the suffocating silence. But it was no use. The forest was disorienting, the trees closing in as though they were trapping him, as if they knew he was lost. In the distance, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice calling his name. But when he looked around, no one was there. He was alone, or so he thought. The whisper came again, louder this time, and Daniel froze. He listened intently, But this time, it wasn't his name he heard, it was something far more sinister. "You will never leave." A chill ran down his spine as he realized the truth. He wasn't alone. The woods were alive, watching him, hunting him. The last thing he remembered was the sound of footsteps behind him, fast and deliberate, closing in. And then, nothing. Daniel Hayes was never found. Despite numerous search parties combing through the dense woods for weeks, there was no trace of him. No sign of his belongings, no footprints, not even a scrap of clothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. Some say the woods claimed him, that the forest has a way of consuming those who venture too far. Others believe he stumbled upon something ancient, something that should not be disturbed. And still, there are those who claim to have heard whispers in the wind when hiking in that same area, a warning, perhaps, for those brave or foolish enough to tread where Daniel Hayes once walked. The vanishing hiker became a legend, a warning whispered around campfires and in the ears of hikers who dared to explore the deep, untouched corners of the Cascade Mountains. And to this day, his disappearance remains unsolved, a mystery buried deep in the shadows of the forest that took him. It had been years since the hospital had been abandoned. The once busy emergency rooms and sterile white hallways were now a shadow of their former selves. Darkened windows and rusted doors lined the vacant floors, where the faint smell of antiseptic still lingered, despite the absence of any living soul. The hospital, once a beacon of hope for the sick and injured, had become a forgotten relic. Yet, there were whispers among the townspeople, of a lingering presence within those walls. It was said that the ghost of a former nurse, Eleanor Reed, still roamed the abandoned halls, her footsteps echoing in the dead of night. Some believed she was still caring for the patients who had died under her watch. Others thought she was searching for redemption, forever tied to the hospital due to an incident that occurred decades ago. Eleanor had worked at the hospital for over 30 years, known for her compassion and diligence. She was the kind of nurse who would go above and beyond for her patients, ensuring they felt comforted in their final moments. But, as with all hospitals, there were casualties. Some of them didn't survive the grueling treatments, others lost their battles to diseases that had no cure. Eleanor had seen it all, but there was one patient that changed everything. It was a cold winter night when Eleanor was assigned to the ICU's most critical patient, a young girl named Lily. She was just 9 years old and had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. Her parents were inconsolable, praying for a miracle. But as days turned into weeks, Lily's condition worsened. Eleanor had grown particularly fond of the little girl. Lily's bright eyes and innocent smile reminded her of the children she had once cared for when she was a new nurse. She often sat by Lily's bedside, holding her hand and talking to her about anything and everything, trying to make her feel safe in a place that was anything but. As Lily's condition deteriorated, Eleanor found herself making a decision that would haunt her forever. The hospital had just received a new experimental drug, one that had shown promise in trials. Eleanor knew it was a long shot, but she was desperate. She approached the head doctor, Dr. Hargrove, and pleaded with him to allow her to administer the drug to Lily, even though it was still unapproved. Dr. Hargrove was adamant about not taking such a risk, but Eleanor's determination and the desperation in her eyes convinced him to give it a try. The drug was administered late one evening, and for a brief moment, it seemed like a miracle. Lily's vitals stabilized, and her parents were hopeful again. But just as quickly, the hope turned to horror. Within hours, Lily's heart stopped beating, and despite Eleanor's best efforts, she could not revive her. The hospital staff was shaken. An investigation was launched into the use of the unapproved drug, and Eleanor was blamed for what was seen as an act of negligence. She was dismissed from her position, her reputation tarnished. But the real punishment came from within her own mind. She could not escape the image of Lily's lifeless body, and every night, she heard the faintest whispers of the girl's voice calling out for her. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed her, that Lily's soul was trapped in the hospital because of the decision she had made. Months passed, and Eleanor's grief only deepened. She was consumed by guilt and remorse, and she spent her days wandering aimlessly, unsure of where to go or what to do. One night, in a final desperate act, Eleanor returned to the hospital. The doors were unlocked, and the halls were eerily silent. She made her way up to the ICU, the place where Lily had taken her last breath. As she entered the room, she felt a chill sweep through the air. The room was dark, save for a faint light coming from the hallway. But there, standing by the window, was Lily. The little girl looked up at her with sad, knowing eyes. Eleanor stepped forward, reaching out, but before she could speak, Lily's figure faded into the shadows. Eleanor, overwhelmed with grief, collapsed to her knees. She could not leave Lily alone, not after what had happened. That night, she swore to stay, to remain in the hospital, guarding its empty halls until Lily's soul was free. And so, the hospital became her home. She wandered the hallways, unable to leave, calling out for Lily, hoping one day the child's spirit would find peace. But it never came. Eleanor's own spirit became intertwined with the hospital's dark history, her soul unable to escape the consequences of her actions. Now, decades later, the hospital stood abandoned, but not entirely empty. Those brave enough to venture inside late at night have reported hearing the soft sound of footsteps echoing through the darkened halls, and sometimes, the faint whisper of a nurse's voice calling out for a child that is no longer there. Those who've dared to explore say they've seen a figure in white, a woman with sad eyes, pushing a forgotten gurney down the empty hallways. It's said that Eleanor still roams the hospital, searching for redemption, forever tethered to the place where her greatest tragedy unfolded. And some believe that if you listen closely enough, you might hear her calling for help, as she searches for the one patient she couldn't save. But no one dares go back anymore. The haunted hospital is a place of sorrow, and Eleanor Reed's story is a cautionary tale for those who believe that the past can never truly be left behind. It was a cool autumn night, the kind where the air feels crisp, and the road seems to stretch endlessly into the unknown. James was on his way home after a long day of work, the headlights of his car illuminating the winding road ahead. The trees along the roadside swayed gently, casting eerie shadows across the asphalt. He had driven this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. There was something unsettling in the air, a sense that something was waiting just beyond his vision. As he drove, the clock on his dashboard read 12:30 a.m. He yawned and adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. He had always been a night owl, but even the most seasoned drivers could feel the fatigue creeping in at this hour. The road was isolated, with no signs of life for miles. James liked the solitude, though, until something caught his eye. Up ahead, by the side of the road, he saw a figure. A person, standing alone in the dark, their silhouette barely visible against the moonlit landscape. James squinted, trying to make out any details. The figure was motionless, their bodies swaying slightly as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. He slowed down as he approached, unsure of whether to stop. His instincts told him not to, but something in the back of his mind urged him to. He rolled down his window just enough to ask if the person needed help. "Do you need a ride?" James called out, his voice muffled by the hum of the engine. The figure didn't respond. They simply stood there, their back to him, facing the road. James hesitated, then noticed the figure's arm slowly raise, pointing towards the passenger seat. The gesture was deliberate, almost eerie. "Come on, I can't leave you out here." "It's too dangerous," James said, his curiosity now outweighing his wariness. He unlocked the passenger door, glancing nervously at the figure. To his surprise, the person didn't turn around or say anything. They simply opened the door and climbed into the car, their footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel. James noticed how strange their movements were, fluid, unnatural, as if the person wasn't fully in control of their body. The figure settled into the seat without a word. "Where are you headed?" James asked, trying to make small talk as he drove forward. But the person remained silent. The atmosphere in the car grew heavier with each passing minute, and the silence became suffocating. James glanced at the rearview mirror, only to find the empty road behind him, stretching endlessly into the night. His mind raced with questions. Was this a real person? Or something else? The air in the car grew colder. James noticed his breath becoming visible in the rearview mirror, like fog on a window. He reached for the heat controls but found that they weren't working. A strange chill seemed to be seeping from the very walls of the car, as though the temperature had dropped well below freezing. Suddenly, the figure's voice broke the silence, soft and raspy, like a whisper from a distant memory. "I need to go home." James turned his head sharply, but the figure was still looking out the window, their face obscured by the shadows. "Where is your home?" James asked, his voice trembling slightly. The words felt foreign, as if the very act of asking the question was forbidden. The figure's hand twitched, and they slowly pointed forward, toward the dark road ahead. "I'll show you," the figure said in a voice that was almost too quiet to hear. It was a command, not a request. Something about the tone of their voice made James uneasy. He had the overwhelming sensation that he was not in control anymore. He tried to push the thought aside, but it clung to him like a shadow. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't speak again. The silence was unbearable, thick with an unseen presence that made James' skin crawl. Every now and then, he would glance at the passenger seat, only to see the figure still sitting motionless, their hands folded neatly in their lap, their face hidden. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and just when James thought he couldn't take it any longer, the figure spoke again. "Stop." James slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement as the car came to a halt. The figure turned toward him now, and James could finally make out their face. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. The mouth, thin and cracked, curled into a smile, one that didn't seem human. "This is where I need to go," the figure whispered, their voice dripping with malice. James felt his heart pound in his chest as the figure slowly opened the car door. Before he could react, they stepped out into the night, disappearing into the darkness of the woods nearby. James watched in horror as the figure's form faded away, as if swallowed by the shadows themselves. A cold breeze swept through the car, and the temperature returned to normal. His hands trembled on the wheel as he quickly drove off, desperate to put distance between himself and whatever that was. The next day, James learned that a woman had gone missing in the area a few months prior, a woman who had been hitchhiking late one night and was last seen near the spot where he had picked up the figure. Her body was never found. The authorities speculated that she had simply disappeared into the night, but James knew the truth. He had given a ride to something that wasn't human, a restless spirit doomed to wander forever, asking for rides to places that only the dead could see. And every time he drove that road, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still waiting for a ride.